The rifle spoke 5 times in 3 seconds. 5 clay targets exploded into dust across the Arizona Canyon, each one placed 100 yards distant, each one shattering before the echo of the previous shot had faded. The Winchester Model 1873 had been custom-fitted, its stock carved to match smaller hands, its sight adjusted for eyes that could find the space between heartbeats. Sarah Cochise, morning, lowered the weapon and breathed out slowly, watching the September heat shimmer across White River Valley like water over stone. Her fingers worked automatically, ejecting spent shells, reloading with practiced efficiency that came from 10,000 repetitions. Her father had taught her this rhythm before she could write her own name, before he died, before they poisoned him and called it natural causes and buried him while she stood silent in a black dress, knowing the truth but unable to prove it. 4 years. 4 years since Thomas fell from his horse during what they called a routine patrol. 4 years since she became a widow at 23. 4 years of this canyon knowing her secrets, while the town of Fort Apache saw only what she allowed them to see. Sarah holstered the Winchester in its saddle scabbard and mounted her horse, a sturdy roan mare that her father had trained. The morning practice was finished. Now came the harder performance. Now came the mask. By the time she reached the town limits, Sarah had transformed herself completely. The rifle was hidden beneath a blanket in her wagon. Her split riding skirt had been replaced by a modest calico dress. Her hair, which she had worn loose during shooting, was now pinned beneath a plain cotton bonnet. She slumped her shoulders slightly and softened her gaze, becoming smaller, less certain, less dangerous. The townspeople of Fort Apache saw exactly what they expected to see, a half-Apache widow struggling to maintain her dead husband's ranch. A woman alone, vulnerable, increasingly desperate as the months wore on and the land demanded more than one person could give. They saw someone to be pitied, perhaps, or scorned, depending on their degree of charity. They did not see a weapon. Sarah sold her vegetables at the market square, enduring the casual cruelties that passed for conversation. Mrs. Harriet Walsh, the pastor's wife, examined Sarah's tomatoes with the air of someone inspecting questionable merchandise. "I suppose these will do," Mrs. Walsh said, her voice carrying across the square, "though they're rather small. I imagine it's difficult to maintain proper cultivation without a man to guide you." Sarah ducked her head and murmured something about doing her best. The words tasted like ash, but they served their purpose. Mrs. Walsh paid half what the tomatoes were worth and moved on, satisfied that the natural order remained intact. Sheriff Malcolm Reed watched this exchange from his office doorway. He was one of the few who knew what Sarah could do with that Winchester, though even he did not know the full extent of it. He caught her eye briefly and gave a small nod. She returned it with equal subtlety. After the market cleared, Reed approached her wagon. "Miss Morning," he said quietly, tipping his hat, "might I have a word?" They walked to the edge of the square where fewer ears could hear. Reed's weathered face carried concern deeper than usual. "Raven's Claw gang," he said without preamble. "They hit a freight wagon east of here 2 days ago, killed the driver, took everything including the horses." Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest. The Raven's Claw had been working the California territories too far away to matter. If they were moving east into Arizona, if they were killing now, instead of just robbing, that meant something had changed. "How many?" she asked. 6 riders, led by Isaiah Blackwood. "You remember him?" Sarah remembered. Blackwood had served briefly at Fort Apache 5 years ago before a gambling scandal and a suspicious shooting had gotten him discharged. He had looked at her the way some men looked at horses they were considering breaking. "They're coming this way," Reed continued, "following the water. Your ranch sits on the only reliable source for 50 miles. I wanted you to know." "Thank you, Sheriff." Reed hesitated, then spoke more quietly. "Your father kept papers, records, things he probably shouldn't have kept. If those men come looking for more than water—" He left the sentence unfinished. Sarah understood. Her father, Cochise, had been more than an Army scout, though that was what his headstone claimed. He had gathered intelligence, reported on corruption, documented things that powerful men wanted to remain undocumented. And then he had died suddenly, clutching his chest, his lips already turning blue from poison that no doctor could identify or treat. "I'll be careful," Sarah said. She was loading the last of her goods when the telegraph operator came running across the square, waving a yellow paper. He found Reed and spoke urgently, words spilling over each other. Sarah couldn't hear the conversation, but she saw Reed's expression darken. She saw him look toward the eastern road. She saw him touch his gun without seeming to realize he had done it. The telegraph operator hurried away. Reed stood alone for a moment, then walked back to Sarah. "They're closer than I thought," he said. 6 riders spotted at Murphy's Creek this morning. That's only 12 miles from here. How long? Hours, maybe less. Reed met her eyes. "Go home, bar your doors. If they come to your ranch, give them whatever they want. Water, food, shelter. Just survive it, Miss Morning. Don't be brave." Sarah nodded obediently, though they both knew she was lying. The ride back to Morning Star Ranch took an hour at a steady pace. Sarah used the time to think, to plan, to remember everything her father had taught her about reading men and situations. The Raven's Claw wanted something specific. Gangs did not change territories without reason. They did not risk new ground unless the reward justified the danger. Her ranch sat on valuable land, but dozens of ranches in Arizona could make that claim. The water rights were worth fighting over, but not worth dying over. Not unless someone had made it worth their while. Not unless someone had pointed them in her direction and promised them something beyond simple robbery. Sarah thought about her father's papers hidden in 3 different locations around the ranch. She thought about the telegram that had arrived the week before her father died, the one he had burned after reading the one that had made him pace the house all night, muttering about betrayal and consequences. She thought about Thomas, her husband, who had been investigating missing ammunition from the Fort Apache armory when his horse allegedly threw him onto the rocks that crushed his skull. Number. These men were not here by chance. Morning Star Ranch appeared as Sarah crested the final rise. 12,000 acres of high desert grassland anchored by the ranch house her father had built from adobe and timber. The house sat with its back to a steep canyon wall, defensible if you knew how to use the terrain. Cochise had known. He had taught Sarah every angle, every approach, every line of sight. She stabled her horse and changed clothes quickly. The calico dress went into the trunk. Leather riding pants and a loose cotton shirt replaced it. She pulled her hair back into a tight braid and buckled on the gun belt that Thomas had given her on their wedding day. The belt was tooled with Apache symbols, a bridge between her 2 worlds that he had commissioned from a leather worker in Tucson. Sarah was loading her Winchester when she heard the horses. 6 riders approached from the east just as Reed had warned. They rode hard but not recklessly, men who knew how to cover ground without exhausting their mounts. Sarah watched from the window, reading their formation, their weapons, their bearing. Professional, experienced, not the kind of men who made mistakes or left witnesses. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to think, to become the frightened widow they expected to find. By the time they reached her door, Sarah had transformed herself again. She met them in the yard, her hands twisting nervously in her apron, her eyes wide and uncertain. The Winchester was propped just inside the doorway where she could reach it but hidden from view. Her father's voice whispered in her memory, "Let them underestimate you. It is the only advantage you need." Isaiah Blackwood dismounted first. His years had not been kind. The black eye patch he wore now covered a socket that had been empty since a knife fight in Denver. His face carried the deep lines of a man who had lived hard and expected to die harder, but his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "Mrs. Morning," he said, his voice carrying false courtesy, "we need water for our horses. Perhaps some food if you can spare it." "Of course," Sarah said, her voice small and frightened. "Perfect. The well is there," Help yourselves." The men dismounted. Sarah watched them carefully, noting details. The youngest one, barely 20, with nervous hands and eyes that would not meet hers. The scarred man in the black duster, who moved like a killer and probably was. The Mexican rider who carried his rifle like he knew how to use it. Each one a piece of a larger puzzle. They watered their horses, but they did not leave. Blackwood approached the house, his spurs jingling with each step. "Heard your father passed," he said. "Cochise morning, fine man. Army scout, wasn't he?" "Yes." "Heard he had quite a collection, medals, commendations, and a fancy Winchester the Army gave him for distinguished service." Blackwood's good eye studied her face. Would that rifle happen to be around still? Sarah felt ice in her veins, but she kept her expression vacant, confused. "The Army took the medals," she lied smoothly. "Said they needed them for records. The rifle is inside, but it's just decoration now. I don't know how to use it properly." One of the gang members, the scarred man, called out from near the barn, "Boss, found fresh tracks. Someone's been doing a lot of shooting, recently." Blackwood's expression hardened. The false courtesy dropped away like a discarded mask. "Is that so coyotes been troubling you, Mrs. Morning?" "Yes," Sarah said quickly. "They come for the chickens. I shoot at them, but I'm not very good. Can barely hit anything." Blackwood smiled, but there was no warmth in it. He reached into his vest and withdrew a playing card, the king of spades, worn and creased. "Tell you what," he said. "Let's have a little demonstration. You hit this card at 30 paces, we'll ride on. No trouble. But if you miss," he let the threat hang unfinished. Sarah made a show of reluctance, of fear, of hesitation. Inside her mind was already calculating distances, wind speed, the angle of the afternoon sun. 30 paces was nothing. 30 paces was insultingly easy. But easy was not the point. The performance was the point. Blackwood placed the card on a fence post. Sarah retrieved the Winchester with trembling hands, handling it awkwardly as if the weight surprised her. The gang members spread out, watching with the lazy confidence of men who had already won. Sarah raised the rifle. She held it wrong stock, too loose against her shoulder stance, too narrow, breathing too fast. Everything her father had trained out of her, she put back in. She fired. The bullet splintered wood 6 inches to the right of the card. The gang erupted in laughter. Blackwood shook his head, more amused than surprised. "Well," he said, "looks like those coyotes are safe." "Please," Sarah said, her voice breaking convincingly. "My father always said I should get 3 shots, for practice." Blackwood spread his hands magnanimously. "Why not, boys? Should we give the lady a sporting chance?" They agreed, still laughing. Sarah took a breath and fired again. This bullet hit 2 inches to the left of the card. Closer, but still a clear miss. The laughter decreased slightly. A few of the men shifted, perhaps wondering if she might actually improve enough to hit it. But they remained relaxed, hands away from their weapons, guards down. Sarah closed her eyes and thought about her father, about Thomas, about every moment that had led to this one. She thought about the years of hiding, of pretending, of being small and afraid, while men who had killed those she loved walked free. Then she opened her eyes and became what her father had spent 20 years creating. The transformation took less than a heartbeat. Her stance locked into perfect alignment, feet planted, shoulders square, rifle seated tight against muscle memory. Her breathing slowed to the rhythm Cochise had drilled into her until it was as natural as her heartbeat. The world narrowed to the card, the wind, the distance, the shot. She fired. The king of spades exploded into 3 perfect pieces, each section tumbling separately to the ground. The bullet had struck the exact center of the card with such precision that it had divided the image almost surgically. Before the last piece of card touched earth, Sarah pivoted. The Winchester swung in a smooth arc, coming to rest, aimed directly at Blackwood's chest. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger. Her eyes held nothing of the frightened widow. They were her father's eyes now, hard, certain, absolutely focused. "Hands where I can see them," she said. Her voice was different. No tremor, no fear, just flat command. Now! The gang froze. 6 men suddenly realizing they had made a terrible miscalculation. "Miguel," Sarah said, not taking her eyes from Blackwood, "you're the youngest. You collect their gun belts, nice and slow. Any of them move wrong. I put a bullet through your boss." The young man hesitated, looking at Blackwood for guidance. Blackwood stared at Sarah, reassessing everything. Finally, he nodded once. Miguel moved carefully, unbuckling gun belts, gathering weapons. The other gang members stood rigid, understanding now that the woman holding that rifle could kill them all before any of them could draw. "You played us," Blackwood said quietly. "No," Sarah replied. "You played yourselves. You saw what you wanted to see. My father taught me that." She waited until Miguel had collected all 6 gun belts and piled them out of reach. Then she gestured with the rifle. "On your knees. Hands behind your heads." They complied. Even professional killers understood when they had been beaten. Sarah was reaching for the rope to bind them when she heard the horse approaching fast. Sheriff Reed appeared over the rise, riding hard, followed by 2 deputies. He reined in sharply when he saw the scene. "Miss Morning," he said, taking in the 6 kneeling men and the rifle in her hands. "I see you didn't take my advice about being careful." "I was careful, Sheriff, just not the way you meant." Reed dismounted, shaking his head with what might have been admiration or exasperation. His deputies began binding the prisoners. "We'll take them to Fort Apache for holding," Reed said. "Federal marshal should be here in a few days. They'll stand trial for the freight robbery and murder." Sarah lowered the Winchester, finally feeling the tension drain from her shoulders. But Blackwood caught her eye as the deputies hauled him to his feet. "This isn't finished," he said quietly. "We were sent here for a reason. Someone wants what your father had. Someone with more reach than you can imagine." Before Sarah could respond, one of the deputies pushed Blackwood toward the horses. Reed organized his prisoners, securing them for the ride to town. Sarah watched, feeling something cold settle deeper in her chest. Blackwood's words echoed with a truth she had been trying not to acknowledge. This was not random. This was targeted. Reed paused before mounting. "Miss Morning, I'll post a deputy nearby tonight just to be safe." "Thank you, Sheriff." She stood in her yard as the sun began setting, painting the canyon walls in shades of amber and rust. The Winchester felt heavy in her hands now, not from physical weight but from what it represented. The mask was gone. The secret was revealed. Whatever came next, she could not go back to being invisible. Inside the house, Sarah lit a lamp and sat at her father's old desk. She pulled out the hidden drawer, the one that held his papers, his codes, his final warnings. She had been putting this off for 4 years, unable to face what he had left behind. But Blackwood's words had made it clear. Whatever her father had known, whatever he had documented, people were willing to kill for it. She was still reading when she heard the distant gunfire. It came from the east, from the direction of town. Multiple shots, then a sustained volley, then silence. Sarah stood slowly, her blood turning to ice water. Sheriff Reed had been transporting 6 prisoners. He had 2 deputies with him. The gunfire had been too intense, too prolonged for a simple escape attempt. Sarah grabbed her rifle and ran to the canyon's edge where she could see the road. Even in the fading light, she could make out the scene. A wagon overturned. Bodies on the ground, horses scattered. She ran for her own mount, but even as she saddled the mare, she knew she would be too late. By the time she reached the ambush site, whoever had done this would be gone. Reed would be dead or captured. The prisoners would be freed. And Sarah would be alone again, but this time everyone would know what she could do. This time, she could not hide. She rode hard through the gathering darkness, but when she reached the overturned wagon, she found exactly what she had feared. 2 deputies dead, Sheriff Reed missing. The Raven's Claw gang gone along with whoever had freed them. Only one thing remained pinned to the wagon with a knife. A piece of paper with a single word written in precise script. Soon. Sarah stood alone on the empty road holding that paper, understanding that everything had just changed. The quiet years were over. The mask was shattered. Whatever war her father had been fighting, it was hers now. She looked back toward her ranch where lamplight gleamed in the window she had left burning. Morning Star Ranch. The legacy her parents had built. The land they had died protecting. She would not let it fall, but she also knew she could not defend it alone. Dawn found Sarah already writing the note still folded in her pocket like a threat, waiting to unfold. She had not slept. Sleep required the luxury of safety, and safety had died with those two deputies on the eastern road. She rode northwest toward the Blackwood Ranch, toward the one man her father had trusted without reservation. Vernon Blackwood was 62, a rancher whose 40 years on the frontier showed in every deliberate movement. His spread bordered Morning Star to the north, 15,000 acres that had made him wealthy through patient work rather than schemes. He had known Cochise before Sarah's birth, stood witness at the wedding that joined Apache and Army, taught her to ride while she was still learning to walk. If there was anyone left in this world she could trust, it was Vernon. She found him in his barn, inspecting a mare's foreleg with the careful attention that had made him wealthy. He looked up as Sarah dismounted, and his lined face showed no surprise at her arrival. Vernon Blackwood was not a man given to surprise. He read situations the way Sarah read rifle sights, with practiced certainty. "Sarah," he said, straightening slowly. His joints protested the movement, but his eyes remained sharp. "I heard about the ambush, about Reed. They took him, freed the Raven's Claw, left me this." She handed him the note. Vernon studied the single word, his jaw tightening. "This is Brennan's work." Sarah felt something cold wrap around her spine. "Colonel Brennan, from Fort Apache. Your father was gathering evidence on him. Cochise told me some of it, not all. Said if anything happened, I should watch over you." Vernon folded the note carefully and handed it back. "He was poisoned because of what he knew. Your husband, too, though they made his death look like an accident." The words hung in the morning air like gun smoke. Sarah had suspected, had known, in the way you know things in your bones even when your mind refuses to accept them. But hearing it spoken aloud, confirmed by a man who did not traffic in lies, made it real in a way that hollowed out her chest. "Thomas was investigating missing ammunition from the fort," Vernon continued. "He found a pattern. Weapons and supplies disappearing, then showing up in Mexico with revolutionary groups. Brennan was running them south, selling them to whoever would pay. Your husband was going to report it to the federal authorities. So they killed him. They made it look like his horse threw him. But Cochise knew better. He started his own investigation, documenting everything: banking records, shipping manifests, witness statements. He was building a case that could destroy Brennan and everyone connected to him." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. "And then they killed him, too." Vernon nodded slowly. "Arsenic in his whiskey. Small doses over weeks. By the time the doctors saw him, it was too late." He paused, his voice softening. "Your father's last words to me were about you. He said you were stronger than anyone knew, that when the time came you would know what to do. I don't feel strong. I feel alone. That's why I'm going to help you." Vernon's tone shifted, becoming the voice of a rancher who had defended his land against drought raids and corrupt land agents for 4 decades. "You can't do this alone, Sarah. This is bigger than revenge. It's about bringing down a conspiracy that reaches into the federal government itself." Sarah met his eyes. "What are you proposing?" "We form an alliance, gather people we can trust, track down the Raven's Claw, and find out who freed them, recover Reed if he's still alive. And most importantly, we find your father's evidence and use it to bring Brennan to justice." "The evidence is hidden. I only know 2 of the locations." "Then we start there. But first we need more help. I know a tracker best in the territory, Eli Stone, half Yaqui, former Army scout. If anyone can find where they took Reed, it's him." Sarah considered this. Every instinct screamed at her to handle this herself, to trust no one, to remain invisible. But those instincts had been shaped by years of hiding, and hiding time was over. "All right," she said. "Where do we find this Eli Stone?" Vernon smiled grimly. "He finds us. I sent word yesterday. He should be here within the hour." They drank coffee in Vernon's ranch house while they waited, and Vernon told her things her father had shared in confidence. About the network of corruption that stretched from Fort Apache to Washington. About railroad companies and European investors buying up Arizona land through intimidation and murder. About men in positions of authority who saw the frontier not as a place for honest people to build lives, but as a resource to be exploited and discarded. "Your ranch sits on the only reliable water source for 50 miles, Vernon explained. "The railroad wants that water. They've been trying to buy you out for 3 years. When you refused to sell, they decided to take it. By sending the Raven's Claw, by using them as cover, make it look like random violence, drive you off the land or kill you trying. Either way, the ranch goes to probate and the railroad can buy it from the territory for pennies." Sarah absorbed this feeling, pieces of a larger pattern clicking into place. "And Brennan is the connection." "Brennan is the ghostwriter," Vernon said quietly. "That's what they call him, the man who makes problems disappear. Your father figured that out 6 months before he died." The sound of an approaching horse interrupted them. Vernon stood and moved to the window, then relaxed. "That's Eli." The man who entered Vernon's ranch house moved with the fluid economy of someone who wasted no motion. Eli Stone was 34, lean and weathered, with black hair, worn long, and eyes that missed nothing. He carried a Winchester and a knife, both worn from use but meticulously maintained. He nodded to Vernon, then turned his attention to Sarah. "You're Cochise's daughter," he said. It was not a question. "I am. I rode with your father 5 years ago, best scout I ever worked with. Taught me to read sign that most men would miss entirely." Eli's expression remained neutral, but something shifted in his voice. "When Vernon sent word that you needed tracking done, I came, not for money, for what I owe your father's memory." Sarah studied him carefully. "Vernon says you can find Sheriff Reed. If he's alive to be found, I'll find him, but understand something, Mrs. Morning. The men who took him are professional. They'll have covered their trail, set false leads, prepared for pursuit. This won't be easy." "I don't need easy. I need results." Eli smiled, for the first time a brief flash of teeth. "You have your father's eyes, and his stubbornness, I'd wager." He turned to Vernon. "What do we know?" They spread out maps on Vernon's table, marking the ambush site, known water sources, possible routes. Eli listened intently, asking questions that revealed the depth of his experience. Where had the gang been heading before the ambush? What supplies had they taken from the wagon? "How many horses did the freed prisoners have?" Sarah answered what she could, appreciating his methodical approach. This was not bravado or bluster. This was a professional at work. "They'll head for the Cortez mine," Eli said, finally tapping a location on the map. "It's abandoned, defensible, and has water. If they're holding Reed for information or ransom, that's where they'll do it." "How far?" Vernon asked. 15 miles northeast. Rough country, easy to defend." Eli glanced at Sarah. "You can shoot. Vernon told me about yesterday. But can you track? Can you move quiet through hostile terrain? My father taught me some, not as much as I wish he had." "Then you'll follow my lead exactly. No improvisation, no heroics. We do this smart or we don't do it at all." Before Sarah could respond, another horse approached at speed. This time Vernon tensed hand, moving toward his rifle, but Eli tilted his head, listening, then relaxed slightly. "Federal badge," he said. "I can hear the hardware." The man who dismounted wore a U.S. Marshal's star and carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had been enforcing law when most men were still learning to shave. Marshal James Cooper was 51, gray at the temples, with scars on his knuckles and a revolver worn smooth from use. He entered without invitation, his eyes cataloging everyone present in a single sweep. "Vernon Blackwood," he said. I'm looking for Mrs. Sarah Morning. I'm Sarah Morning." Cooper studied her with the same intensity she had seen in judges and army officers, men who made decisions that carried weight. "I'm investigating the murder of 2 federal deputies and the kidnapping of Sheriff Malcolm Reed," he said. "I have reason to believe you witnessed the initial capture of the Ravensclaw gang." "I did more than witness it. I captured them." One eyebrow rose. "The report said 6 armed men were subdued and disarmed by a single individual. I assumed that was an exaggeration." "It wasn't." Cooper's expression shifted to something approaching respect. "Then you and I need to talk, because those men didn't escape on their own. Someone with resources and authority freed them. Someone who wants whatever it is you have." Sarah made a decision. She reached into her saddlebag and withdrew one of her father's ledgers, the one she had retrieved from its hiding place before riding to Vernon's ranch. She set it on the table. "My father was documenting corruption, gun running, land fraud. This ledger has names, dates, bank transfers. It implicates Colonel Richard Brennan and a network of officials in 3 territories." Cooper opened the ledger carefully, his expression hardening as he scanned the pages. "This is federal evidence. How long have you had this?" 4 years, since my father died. I didn't know what to do with it, who to trust. And now, Sheriff Reed is missing, and men are trying to kill me for it. So I'm trusting you, Marshal Cooper. Don't make me regret it." Cooper closed the ledger and met her eyes. "I've been investigating Brennan for 2 years, following whispers and rumors and bodies that pile up too conveniently. This ledger is the first hard evidence I've seen." He paused. "But it's not complete. There are references to other documents, other evidence. Do you have them?" "Some. My father hid them in multiple locations. I only know 2 of them." "Then we need to recover them before Brennan does. And we need to find Sheriff Reed alive. He can testify to the ambush, verify the chain of evidence." Cooper looked at each of them in turn. "I'm proposing an alliance. Federal authority, local knowledge and skills that complement each other. We find Reed, recover the evidence, and bring Brennan to justice through legal means." Vernon spoke first. "I'm in. Cochise was my friend. This needs to end properly." Eli nodded. "I'll track. But I want it understood that when we find these men, there are no guarantees they'll surrender peacefully." Cooper's expression remained neutral. "I'm a federal marshal, not a priest. I enforce the law, but I also understand that sometimes the law catches up to men at the end of a gun barrel." They all looked at Sarah. She felt the weight of their attention, the moment balanced on her decision. This was what her father had prepared her for, even if neither of them had known it at the time. Not just the shooting, not just the skill, but the leadership, the willingness to trust others while remaining clear-eyed about the stakes. "We do this together," she said. "We find Reed, we recover the evidence, we bring Brennan down." She paused. "But I want one thing understood. These men killed my father. They killed my husband. When the time comes for justice, I'm going to be there." "Agreed," Cooper said simply. They spent the next hour planning. Eli would scout ahead to the Cortez mine, confirm the gang's location, assess their defenses. Vernon would gather supplies and horses, recruit 3 trusted ranch hands who could ride and shoot. Cooper would coordinate with federal authorities, request backup from Fort Bowie, and establish legal jurisdiction. And Sarah would return to Morning Star Ranch, retrieve her father's second cache of evidence from beneath the floorboards of the old barn, and prepare for what was coming. They separated near midday, each to their assigned tasks. But as Sarah mounted her horse, Vernon called out, "There's something else you should know. Something Cochise told me but made me swear not to share until the time was right." Sarah waited. "Your husband kept a journal, detailed observations about everything he saw at Fort Apache. Troop movements, supply shipments, suspicious orders. He gave it to me for safekeeping a week before he died. Said if anything happened to him, you should have it." Vernon retrieved a leather-bound book from his saddlebag and handed it across. Sarah took it with trembling hands, feeling the weight of Thomas's words before she even opened it. "Read it tonight. Vernon said gently. But be prepared. What he documented will hurt. Sarah rode home through the afternoon heat, the journal pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat. She completed her evening chores, mechanically feeding animals, checking water levels, securing doors. But her mind was on the leather book sitting on her father's desk, waiting. When full darkness fell, Sarah lit a lamp and opened Thomas's journal. His handwriting was precise, methodical, the script of a man trained to observe and record. The first entries were routine, supply inventories, patrol schedules, weather observations, but as she turned pages, a pattern emerged. Ammunition shortages that didn't match consumption rates, weapons signed out to units that didn't exist, wagons leaving the fort at night returning empty at dawn, and through it all one name appearing again and again, Colonel Brennan. Then she reached the final entry dated 3 days before Thomas died. I have confirmed my suspicions, he had written. Brennan is the ghostwriter. He personally leads the gun-running operation, using his position to authorize shipments that go missing en route. I have documented 17 separate incidents over 6 months. Tomorrow I ride to Fort Bowie to meet with General Morrison. If I can present this evidence to someone outside Brennan's sphere of influence, we can bring him to justice. Sarah will understand why I had to do this. I only pray I can return to her safely. The entry ended there. The next pages were blank. Sarah closed the journal slowly, feeling tears she had not allowed herself for 4 years, finally breaking through. Thomas had known the danger. He had documented it. He had tried to do the right thing, and it had gotten him killed. She did not hear the knock at first, so lost was she in grief. But when it came again, harder, more insistent, she wiped her eyes and moved to the door with one hand on her revolver. "It's Eli," came the quiet voice. "I found them." Sarah opened the door. The tracker stood in the moonlight, his face grim. The Cortez mine. 6 men total. Raven's Claw plus whoever freed them. They have Reed. He's alive but injured. They're holding him in the main tunnel. How many guards? 3 outside. The rest inside with Reed, but there's something else you need to know. Eli paused. The man who freed them isn't with the Raven's Claw. He's separate, professional. And he's asking Reed questions about your father's evidence. Specific questions, like he knows exactly what he's looking for. Sarah felt ice settle in her stomach. Did you see his face? Only in profile, but I heard his voice when he was interrogating Reed. Educated, precise, military bearing. Harrington, Sarah said quietly. Brennan's enforcer, the ghostwriter's shadow. We move at dawn, Eli said. Vernon is gathering men. Cooper is riding in from the north with 2 deputies. We'll have numbers and surprise. Sarah nodded, but her mind was already racing ahead. Harrington was not at the mine by coincidence. This was a trap. They wanted her to come. They wanted the evidence she carried, which meant she had to give them exactly what they expected. But not in the way they anticipated. They assembled in the pre-dawn darkness at a ridge overlooking the Cortez mine. 7 in total. Sarah, Vernon, Eli, Marshall, Cooper, and 3 of Vernon's ranch hands who had fought Apaches and claimed jumpers and knew how to follow orders under fire. The mine sprawled below them, a skeleton of rotting timbers and collapsed tunnels lit by a single campfire where 3 men stood guard. Vernon studied the layout through field glasses, his weathered hands steady despite the cold. The main tunnel entrance is there, 2 guards visible. Third one is patrolling between the old processing shed and the entrance. They're professional about it, rotating every 20 minutes. Where's Reed? Cooper asked quietly. Inside, Eli said. I saw them take him deeper into the tunnel last night. He was walking but favoring his left side, conscious and aware. Sarah checked her Winchester for the 3rd time, a ritual more than necessity. The rifle was loaded, clean, ready. But the repetition calmed her mind, focused her on what needed to happen. 3 guards outside meant 3 more inside minimum. Harrington plus the Raven's Claw. 9 men total against their 7. Sarah takes high position on the north ridge. Vernon said, laying out the plan they had constructed during the ride. "She'll have clear sight lines to the entrance and processing shed. Eli, you circle south, come in through the ventilation shaft like you scouted. Cooper, you and your deputies approach from the west with the horses. Make it look like you're the main force." "And you?" Cooper asked. "I coordinate timing. Make sure we all move together. No one goes early, no one hangs back. Harrington is expecting an attack. We need to give him what he expects, but from directions he can't anticipate." Sarah spoke for the first time since they had arrived. "Reed is the priority. We get him out alive. Everything else is secondary." "Agreed," Cooper said. "But understand something. If Harrington or any of his men go for weapons, we respond. I won't sacrifice good people to preserve bad ones." The first light of dawn was painting the eastern sky when they moved into position. Sarah climbed the north ridge alone, finding a spot between two boulders that gave her cover while providing clear angles on the mine entrance. She settled in, checking distance markers, calculating wind drift, mentally cataloging every piece of terrain between her position and the target. 300 yards to the main entrance, 200 to the processing shed. Long shots, but well within her capability. Her father had trained her to shoot accurately at 500 yards. These distances were comfortable. Below, she could see Cooper and his deputies emerging from the western approach on horseback, riding openly, making no attempt at stealth. The guards spotted them immediately, one running into the tunnel to alert the others, while two took defensive positions behind the old ore cart. Sarah controlled her breathing, waiting. This was the moment that would determine everything. If Harrington panicked, if he killed Reed, then none of this mattered. But Harrington did not panic. He emerged from the tunnel with Sheriff Reed in front of him, one arm wrapped around Reed's throat, a revolver pressed against his temple. Reed's face was bruised, his left arm hanging awkwardly, but his eyes were alert. He saw Cooper approaching and gave the slightest shake of his head. A warning. "That's far enough, Marshal," Harrington called out. His voice carried the educated precision Eli had described, each word carefully enunciated. "I assume you're here for the sheriff, and I assume Mrs. Morning is somewhere nearby with that remarkable rifle of hers." Cooper reined in his horse 50 yards from the mine entrance. "Release Sheriff Reed. We can negotiate the rest." "Negotiate," Harrington repeated as if tasting the word. "An interesting proposition. But I'm not here to negotiate, Marshal. I'm here to recover property stolen from my employer. Specifically, documents compiled by Cochise Morning before his unfortunate death. Those documents are federal evidence in an ongoing investigation. Those documents are leverage, and Mrs. Morning will trade them for the sheriff's life. Won't you, Sarah?" Sarah remained motionless on the ridge, her rifle trained on Harrington's head. One shot. She could take it right now. Drop him before he could pull the trigger. But Reed was too close. Any flinch, any muscle spasm as Harrington fell, and that revolver would discharge. Reed would die. So she waited, trusting Vernon's plan, trusting Eli to be in position. "I'm waiting, Sarah," Harrington called out. "Show yourself. Bring the ledgers. We'll make an exchange like civilized people." Instead, Sarah shifted her aim slightly and fired. The bullet struck the iron bell mounted above the mine entrance, the one used decades ago to signal shift changes. The clang was enormous, echoing across the canyon, and every man below instinctively flinched toward the sound. In that moment of distraction, Eli Stone emerged from the ventilation shaft behind the processing shed. He moved like smoke, covering 20 feet in absolute silence, and took down the guard patrolling there with a knife. No sound, no struggle, just sudden unconsciousness. Harrington recovered quickly, yanking Reed backward toward the tunnel entrance. Clever, but not clever enough. "Let me offer a counter-proposal," Sarah called out, her voice carrying clearly across the distance. "You release Sheriff Reed. You and your men surrender to Marshal Cooper, and I don't put the next bullet through your gun hand." Harrington laughed, genuinely amused. "You're, 300 yards away, uphill with wind. You might be good, Mrs. Morning, but no one is that good." Sarah fired again. The bullet hit the revolver's cylinder, spinning it from Harrington's hand. The weapon clattered 6 feet away. The shock on Harrington's face was worth every hour Sarah had spent practicing impossible shots with her father. The absolute certainty that he had calculated the situation correctly, meeting the reality that he had underestimated his opponent completely. Reed drove his elbow backward into Harrington's ribs and broke free, stumbling toward Cooper's position. Two of the Raven's Claw members started to raise weapons, but Sarah's next shot split the dirt between their feet close enough that they felt the displaced earth against their boots. "I have 17 rounds left," Sarah announced. "I can wound every man down there before you reach cover, or you can surrender and face trial. Your choice happens in the next 5 seconds." "Lower your weapons," Harrington said quietly. His professional demeanor had returned, recognizing when a tactical situation had shifted beyond recovery. "We're done here." Cooper and his deputies moved in quickly, securing prisoners with efficient practice. Eli emerged from cover, checking the unconscious guard for weapons before binding him. Vernon appeared from the south with his ranch hands having circled wide to cut off any escape routes. Sarah descended from the ridge, her Winchester still ready, still scanning for threats. She trusted Cooper's judgment, but trust did not mean carelessness. She found Reed sitting against a wagon wheel while one of Vernon's men wrapped his ribs. The sheriff looked up as she approached, managing a painful smile. "Miss Morning, I should have known you wouldn't follow my advice about staying safe." "You should have known," Sarah agreed. She knelt beside him. "How bad?" "Cracked ribs. Dislocated shoulder. They reset poorly. Nothing that won't heal." His expression sobered. "But Sarah, what they were asking about what they know, it's worse than we thought." Harrington was secured now, hands bound, sitting with his back against the ore cart under Cooper's watchful eye. But when he saw Sarah approaching, he smiled. "Cochise prepared you for this moment," he said. "That was remarkable shooting, truly, but it changes nothing. Colonel Brennan knows you have the evidence. He knows you've allied with federal authorities, and he has resources you cannot begin to imagine." "Tell me about these resources," Sarah said quietly. "European banking interests, railroad corporations, territorial governors who see Arizona as nothing more than a commodity to be exploited. Your father discovered a conspiracy that stretches from Mexico City to Washington. He compiled evidence that could destroy political careers, topple financial empires, redirect the future of Western expansion. So you killed him." "I followed orders." "Cochise Morning was a threat to powerful people, as was your husband. As are you, frankly, though I suspect that calculation will prove to have been a mistake." Harrington's eyes held something approaching respect. "You're more like your father than they anticipated." Reed interrupted, his voice strained with pain but urgent. "Sarah Brennan is the ghostwriter. I thought it was just a nickname for the gang, but it's him specifically. He's been coordinating land seizures throughout the territory, sending raiders to drive off homesteaders, then buying up the land through shell companies. Your ranch has been his primary target for 3 years because of the water rights." Vernon joined them, his expression grim. "How many operations?" 17 that I know of," Reed said. "Small ranches mostly. Families who couldn't defend themselves. Those who resisted were found dead, killed in ways that looked like Apache raids or Mexican bandits. But it was always Brennan's men. Always the ghostwriter." Sarah felt something cold and certain settling in her chest. This was not just about her father or Thomas or even her ranch. This was systematic murder for profit carried out by a man wearing an army uniform and protected by powerful interests. "We need to get this to trial," Cooper said. "Federal court in Tucson." With Reed's testimony, Harrington's confession, and the evidence Cochise compiled, we can bring charges that will stand. But before anyone could respond, the youngest of the Raven's Claw prisoners spoke up. Miguel Santos, barely 20, with frightened eyes and hands that trembled despite being bound. "It won't matter," he said quietly. "Brennan has judges bought, lawyers on retainer. Even if you get him to trial, he'll walk free." "Not with federal jurisdiction," Cooper countered. I've already requested a circuit judge from Denver, someone outside the local corruption. Miguel shook his head. You don't understand. This isn't just local. The people he works for, they have reach everywhere. He paused, then spoke directly to Sarah. I want to help. I didn't know about the murders when I joined the Raven's Claw. Blackwood told us we were just doing land work, scaring off squatters. By the time I realized what was really happening, I was in too deep. Sarah studied the young man, seeing genuine fear and perhaps genuine remorse. Why should I believe you? Because I have information you need. Brennan is moving against your ranch, right now. He's gathering men at Fort Apache, maybe 20 soldiers loyal to him personally. He's planning to attack Morning Star Ranch under the guise of pursuing escaped prisoners. He'll kill you, seize your land, and claim he was acting in defense of territorial security. Vernon swore quietly. When? Tomorrow, maybe sooner. He knows you've allied with the marshal. He knows time is running out for him. So he's going to eliminate the threat directly. Sarah looked at Cooper, then Vernon, then Eli. We need to get back to the ranch, now. Fortify it, prepare defenses. Against 20 trained soldiers, one of Vernon's ranch hands asked. That's not a fight we can win. We don't need to win. Sarah said, her mind already racing through tactical possibilities. We need to hold long enough for federal reinforcements to arrive. And we need to document everything Brennan does, every illegal order, every violent act. We turn his attack into the evidence that convicts him. Cooper nodded slowly. I can request Army backup from Fort Bowie. Colonel Morrison commands there. He's clean outside Brennan's influence, but it will take time for them to mobilize. How much time? Vernon asked. 36 hours minimum, Sarah calculated quickly. If Brennan moved tomorrow, they would have perhaps 18 hours to prepare, 18 hours to turn Morning Star Ranch into a defensible position, 18 hours to get ready for a siege that would determine not just her survival, but the fate of everyone who had trusted her father's evidence. Then we ride hard, she said. Vernon, bring your men and whatever weapons you can spare. Eli, I need you to teach my ranch hands Apache defensive tactics. Cooper, coordinate with Fort Bowie and document everything. We're going to make Brennan come to us, and when he does, we're going to make sure the whole territory sees what he really is. They prepared to move out, securing prisoners to horses, checking weapons, redistributing supplies. But as Sarah mounted her roan mare, Miguel called out again. Mrs. Morning, there's one more thing. Brennan knows about your father's other evidence caches. He's already recovered 2 of them. Whatever you're hiding at the ranch, it's the last piece he needs to erase completely. Sarah felt her blood turn cold. How many caches did my father create? 3. 1 under the barn at your ranch. 1 hidden in a safety deposit box in Tucson. 1 location we never discovered. Miguel paused. The Tucson cache was emptied last week. If Brennan gets the ranch cache too, all you'll have is Reed's testimony and that ledger. It might not be enough. Vernon moved his horse close to Sarah's. The 3rd location. Did Cochise ever mention it to you? Sarah thought back through years of conversations, searching for any hint her father might have left. And then she remembered. A comment made 2 weeks before he died, sitting on the porch of Morning Star Ranch, watching the sunset over the canyon. Legacy is not what you leave behind, he had said. It's what you build into the people who survive you. Not what you leave behind, what you build in. Sarah looked at Vernon, understanding flooding through her. It's not hidden somewhere. He gave it to someone he trusted to keep it safe until the right moment. Who? But Sarah already knew. There was only one person her father had trusted, that completely one person who had known both his secret work and his commitment to justice. You, she said to Vernon. He gave it to you. That's why he made you promise to watch over me. Not just to protect me, but to know when the time was right to reveal the final evidence. Vernon was silent for a long moment. Then he reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a sealed envelope yellowed with age, marked with Cochise's distinctive handwriting. He made me swear not to open it unless you were in mortal danger and had proven yourself worthy of his legacy, Vernon said quietly. I think that time has come. Sarah took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in her father's precise script. Names, dates, bank account numbers, but more importantly, a map showing the entire conspiracy network, every connection between Brennan and his European backers, every politician who had accepted bribes, every judge who had dismissed evidence. It was complete, comprehensive, devastating. "This is everything," Cooper breathed, reading over her shoulder. "This is enough to bring down the entire network." "Which is why Brennan will do anything to prevent it from reaching a courtroom," Sarah said. She folded the paper carefully and secured it inside her shirt. "We ride for Morning Star Ranch. We prepare for siege, and we make sure this evidence survives no matter what it costs." They rode hard through the morning, pushing the horses as fast as the terrain would allow. Behind them, the Cortez mine receded into distance. Ahead, Morning Star Ranch waited peaceful in the sunlight, unaware that it was about to become a battlefield. Sarah touched the paper pressed against her ribs, feeling her father's words like a heartbeat. He had prepared for this moment. He had known it would come, and he had trusted her to be ready. Now she would prove that trust was not misplaced. As the ranch buildings came into view, Eli rode up beside her. "You know this is going to get bloody. Brennan won't surrender. He can't afford to." "I know. You ready for that? For what it means?" Sarah thought about her father dying slowly from poison while pretending everything was normal. About Thomas murdered and made to look like an accident. About every family driven from their land by men who saw human lives as obstacles to profit. "I've been ready," she said quietly. "I just didn't know it until now." Dusk settled over the ranch as they arrived, shadows lengthening across the canyon. They had perhaps 12 hours before Brennan arrived. 12 hours to prepare. 12 hours before everything her father had built, everything he had died protecting, would be tested in fire and blood. Sarah dismounted and looked at the ranch her parents had carved from wilderness, the house they had built together, the land they had chosen to defend. She would not let it fall, not to Brennan, not to anyone. Vernon joined her, reading her expression. "Your father used to say that some ground is worth dying for, but the truly valuable ground is worth living for, worth fighting for, until the fight is won." "Then we fight," Sarah said simply, "and we make sure the fight is won." Behind them, men were already moving, unloading weapons, checking defensive positions, preparing for the siege that dawn would bring. The alliance had been formed. The evidence was secured. The final battle was coming, and Sarah Cochise Morning was ready. The first hour after sunset was organized chaos. Vernon moved through the ranch like a general preparing for siege, his 40 years of frontier experience translating into decisive action. He positioned men at windows, reinforced doors with spare lumber-filled barrels with water in case of fire. Sarah watched him work, grateful for leadership that came not from authority, but from earned respect. "The canyon wall protects our back," Vernon explained, sketching positions in the dirt with a stick. "That means Brennan can only approach from 3 sides, east, west, and south. We funnel them into kill zones where Sarah's rifle can reach." Eli crouched beside him, studying the improvised map with a tracker's eye for terrain. "The barn provides cover, but it's also a liability. Wood structure, dry hay. One fire arrow, and we lose half our defensive position." "So we soak it," Vernon said. "Drench every wall, every beam. Make it too wet to burn easily." He looked at his ranch hands. "You 3 get buckets. Start with the barn, then the outbuildings. Cooper, position your deputies where they can document everything. I want witnesses to every action Brennan takes." Marshal Cooper nodded, already organizing his men. "I'll set up observation posts with clear sight lines. Written records, sworn statements, everything documented for federal court." Sarah climbed to the ranch house roof, testing angles and distances. From here she could see the eastern approach clearly, nearly 400 yards of open ground before reaching the first buildings. The western route was more complex, broken by a dry creek bed and scattered boulders that provided cover. The southern approach offered the best concealment with scrub brush and rolling terrain that could hide an advancing force until they were within 200 yards. "That's where they'll come hardest," Eli said, joining her on the roof. He moved with the casual balance of someone who spent more time outdoors than in. "If I were planning this attack, I'd feint east and west. Draw your attention, then push the main force south through the brush." Sarah considered this, calculating fields of fire reload times the logistics of defending 3 approaches simultaneously with limited personnel. "Can we create obstacles, slow them down?" "We can try. String wire between the brush low enough to trip horses. Dig a few shallow trenches, nothing deep enough to see from distance, but enough to break momentum." Eli paused, studying her face in the fading light. "Your father taught you to think tactically. That's good. But tactics only matter if you're willing to follow through. When Brennan's men come, when the shooting starts, can you pull that trigger, knowing you might kill someone?" Sarah thought about the question, about the weight it carried. She had shot at targets her entire life, at clay and cards and distant rocks. She had captured the raven's claw without killing anyone. But Eli was asking something different. He was asking if she could cross the line her father had crossed, the one that separated warning shots from lethal force. "My father was poisoned," she said quietly. "My husband was murdered. 17 families were driven from their land, some of them killed. If Brennan's men come here to finish what they started, then yes, I can pull the trigger." Eli nodded, accepting this. "Then I'll teach you something your father probably didn't. Apache warriors don't shoot to kill immediately. We wound first when we can. A wounded man requires 2 others to carry him, removes 3 from the fight instead of 1. And wounded men scream, break the morale of those still fighting. That's cruel. That's survival. That's how smaller forces defeat larger ones. Not through superior firepower, but through superior tactics and willingness to use every advantage." He gestured toward the southern approach. "Tomorrow when they come, you don't need to kill 20 men. You need to break their will to attack. Make it costly enough that surrender becomes preferable to advance." Sarah absorbed this lesson, understanding its brutal logic, even as part of her recoiled from it. But Eli was right. They were outnumbered, outgunned, in terms of raw numbers. Their only advantages were defensive position, preparation time, and her ability to hit targets other shooters would consider impossible. She needed to use those advantages completely. They climbed down from the roof, and Sarah walked to the barn where Vernon's men had already begun soaking the walls with bucket after bucket of water. The wood darkened, dripping, becoming sodden and resistant to fire. Inside, Vernon was organizing ammunition, distributing rifles to ranch hands who normally used them only for hunting. "Most of these men are farmers and cowboys," Vernon said as Sarah entered. "They can shoot well enough to hit a coyote or a stray steer, but they've never fired at another human being. That changes a man. I need you to understand that not all of them will hold when the pressure comes." "What do you suggest?" "Position them where they provide cover and suppressing fire, but don't depend on them for precision work. The killing shots, the shots that matter most, those are yours and Eli's. Maybe Cooper's deputies if they've seen combat." Vernon checked his own rifle, a well-maintained Winchester that had probably seen action in the Apache Wars. "I'll coordinate, keep everyone focused, prevent panic. But Sarah, if this goes wrong, if Brennan breaks through, I need you to promise me something." "What?" "You run, take the evidence, and ride hard for Fort Bowie. Get it to Colonel Morrison. Don't try to be a hero. Your father's work is more important than any single stand." Sarah shook her head. "I'm not running. This is my land, my legacy." "Your father said the same thing, and it got him killed." Vernon's voice was gentle but firm. "Legacy isn't just about holding ground. It's about making sure the truth survives to matter. Promise me, Sarah, if it comes to that choice, you'll choose survival." She wanted to argue, to insist that she would never abandon the ranch, never leave the people who had come to defend it. But looking at Vernon's weathered face, seeing the genuine concern there, she understood what he was really asking. He was asking her to honor her father's work by ensuring it reached completion, even if that meant personal sacrifice. "I promise," she said finally, "but it won't come to that." Vernon smiled, though it did not quite reach his eyes. "Your father's daughter indeed, stubborn to the core." They worked through the night, each person finding their role in the preparation. Vernon positioned barrels of sand at strategic windows, creating firing positions that could absorb return fire. Eli and two ranch hands strung wire through the southern brush, creating invisible trip lines that would tangle horses and men in darkness. Cooper wrote careful notes documenting the threat, the defensive measures, building a legal record that would support federal prosecution. And Sarah prepared her shooting positions. 3 locations each, offering different angles and distances. The roof for long-range work 400 yards plus. The barn loft for mid-range 200 to 300. And a reinforced position behind the water trough for close defense if the perimeter was breached. She cached ammunition at each position, 30 rounds per location, along with water and basic medical supplies. If she was wounded, if she needed to move between positions under fire, she needed to be able to sustain herself. Near midnight, as most of the men settled into rotation for watch duty, Sarah found herself alone in the ranch house. The building felt different now, transformed from home into fortress. Furniture had been moved to create firing lanes. Windows were reinforced with shutters. The comfortable space where she had lived for years had become purely functional. She pulled out her father's final letter again, the one Vernon had carried for 4 years, and read it completely for the first time. The writing was weaker than Cochise's normal, precise script, the words showing the strain of a dying man forcing himself to communicate critical information. But the message was clear. "Daughter," he had written, "if you are reading this, then Vernon has judged the time right to share what I could not tell you while alive. The evidence I have compiled reaches beyond simple corruption. It reveals a systematic effort by European banking interests to seize control of Arizona territory through violence and manipulation. They fund revolutionaries in Mexico to destabilize the region. They bribe American officials to look away from gun running and murder. They see this land not as home, but as resource to be extracted. I have documented 17 major operations, each resulting in death or displacement. The water rights at Morning Star Ranch make your land uniquely valuable. Whoever controls that water controls development for 50 miles in every direction. That is why they killed Thomas when he discovered their operations. That is why they poisoned me when I refused to stop investigating. But you, daughter, you have advantages they cannot anticipate. You have been trained in skills they do not expect a woman to possess. You can move between worlds, appearing harmless while being deadly. Use this. Trust Vernon. Trust only those who knew your mother's song. The evidence is complete. Names, dates, bank transfers, murder contracts, everything needed to bring them to justice through legal means. But if legal means fail, if corruption runs too deep, then you must use the skills I taught you to protect what matters, not revenge. Protection. There is a difference. I loved you from the moment you were born. Your mother and I chose this land carefully, knowing it would someday need defending. We raised you to be that defender, not because we wanted violence for you, but because we understood that sometimes peace requires those willing to fight for it. Be strong. Be smart. Be the bridge between worlds that your mother always said you would become. Your father, Cochise Morning. Sarah folded the letter carefully, feeling tears she had not allowed herself finally breaking through. She had spent 4 years in grief, in hiding and uncertainty about who she was supposed to be. But reading her father's words, understanding his full intention, she felt something shift inside her. She was not just defending a ranch. She was defending a vision her parents had held, a belief that this land could be more than a commodity, that it could be home for people willing to build rather than exploit. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Vernon entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this," he said, handing her one. "Can't sleep either. Too much to think about." Vernon settled into a chair across from her, his joints protesting the movement. "I was there the day your father chose this land, 1862, right after the Homestead Act passed. He could have claimed property anywhere in the territory, but he chose here specifically. You know why? Sarah shook her head. Because of the canyon wall. He said any fool could build on flat ground, but it takes vision to see how terrain becomes advantage. That wall meant enemies could only approach from 3 sides, meant we'd always have our backs protected. He was thinking about this moment, Sarah. 24 years ago, he was already planning for the day when someone would try to take what he built. He couldn't have known it would be Brennan specifically. No, but he knew the type. Men who see value only in extraction, who measure worth only in profit. Your father fought those men his entire life, first as a warrior, then as a scout, finally as someone gathering evidence to defeat them through law rather than violence. Vernon sipped his coffee, his eyes distant with memory. The night before he died, he came to my ranch, said he'd been poisoned, knew he was dying. Made me promise to watch over you to keep the final evidence safe until you were ready. He said you'd know when that time came. I'm not sure I'm ready now. Ready isn't about feeling certain. It's about understanding what needs to be done and being willing to do it despite fear. Vernon leaned forward. Tomorrow men will come to kill you to seize this land, to destroy everything your father worked for. You'll be afraid. That's natural. But your father trained you for this. Not just the shooting, but the thinking, the strategy, the willingness to protect what matters. Sarah met his eyes. Tell me about my mother. Father rarely spoke of her after she died. Vernon smiled, genuine warmth breaking through his weathered features. Desba was the strongest woman I ever knew. Apache medicine woman, daughter of a chief, but she chose your father when everyone said she was betraying her people. She said she saw no betrayal in loving someone who honored both worlds. She taught your father Apache ways, taught him to see terrain the way warriors see it, to move quietly, to read sign that others missed. She taught him the shooting techniques. Some of them, Apache warriors could hit targets at distances that seemed impossible. Your father combined that with Army marksmanship training, then taught it all to you. You're the product of both worlds, Sarah. That's your strength, not your weakness. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking coffee, listening to the night sounds outside. Men on watch duty moved quietly. Horses shifted in the barn. The ordinary sounds of a ranch settling into darkness, made strange by the knowledge of what dawn would bring. Eli found them there an hour before sunrise. They're coming. I rode out to the eastern ridge, saw their campfires about 8 miles out. 20 men, maybe more. They'll be here within 2 hours. Vernon stood the moment of reflection, passing into immediate action. Wake everyone. Final positions. Sarah, you know what to do. Sarah set down her coffee and picked up her Winchester. The rifle felt familiar in her hands, an extension of herself after years of practice. She checked the load one more time, though she knew it was ready. The ritual mattered more than the verification. She walked outside into the pre-dawn darkness. Stars still burned overhead, indifferent to human conflict. The canyon wall loomed behind the ranch, solid and protective. Her father had chosen well. Cooper appeared from the barn, his deputies with him. Observation posts are ready. We have documentation prepared. Whatever happens here today, it will be recorded. Good. Sarah looked at the eastern horizon, seeing the first hint of light. Brennan is expecting an easy victory, a widow, and a few ranch hands. He's not expecting coordinated defense. He's definitely not expecting you, Cooper said. That shooting at the mine, disarming Harrington from 300 yards. I've seen Army snipers who couldn't make that shot. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. My father believed in preparation, in being better than anyone expected, in using every advantage no matter how unconventional. Dawn broke cold and clear, the eastern sky shifting from black to gray to pale blue. Beautiful and terrible, like so many things in this land. Sarah climbed to her primary position on the ranch house roof, settling in behind the reinforced parapet Vernon had constructed during the night. From here, she could see for miles. The eastern approach still empty, but soon to be filled with Brennan's men. the southern brush where Eli had strung wire, the western creek bed that offered cover but also limited mobility. She was ready. Below, Vernon organized the final defenses, positioning men, checking weapons, speaking quiet words of encouragement. Eli moved between positions, teaching last-minute tactics, showing ranch hands how to reload quickly, how to aim for center mass, how to stay calm when bullets started flying. And in the observation post, Cooper prepared to document everything, to create the legal record that would matter long after the shooting stopped. Sarah touched the folded letter in her pocket, feeling her father's presence. Cochise had prepared her for this moment, had spent her entire life building the skills, the mindset, the determination she would need. Now it was time to prove he had chosen wisely. Sunrise came fast, harsh light, exposing the approaching riders, and there, silhouetted against the dawn, Sarah saw them. 20 riders approaching in military formation, led by a man whose bearing screamed authority even at distance. Colonel Richard Brennan, the Ghost Rider, the man who had killed her father and husband, who had murdered 17 families, who thought Morning Star Ranch was just another obstacle to be eliminated. He was about to discover how wrong he was. Sarah chambered around and waited patient as stone while the enemy approached. Vernon had taken position below, ready to coordinate. Eli was invisible in the barn loft, his rifle covering the southern approach. Cooper watched from the observation post, pen ready to document. The alliance was set. The evidence was secured. The defense was prepared. Morning Star Ranch would not fall. Not today, not ever. Colonel Richard Brennan rode under a white flag of truce, his posture military perfect despite the early hour. He approached alone, stopping his horse 50 yards from the ranch house, close enough for conversation, but far enough to retreat if necessary. Sarah watched him through her rifle sight, studying the man who had orchestrated her father's murder. He was 56, gray at the temples, with the weathered features of someone who had spent decades on the frontier. His uniform was immaculate, despite the dusty ride, his bearing that of a career officer accustomed to command. But his eyes, even at this distance, held something cold and calculating that had nothing to do with military discipline. "Mrs. Morning," he called out, his voice carrying the educated precision of West Point training. "I've come to make you an offer. A fair price for your ranch and safe passage to anywhere in the territory you choose. No one else needs to die today." Sarah remained silent on the roof, her Winchester steady. Let him talk. Let Cooper document every word. Brennan waited, then continued when no response came. "Your father was a stubborn man. It cost him his life. Your husband made the same mistake. I'm offering you the opportunity to learn from their errors." "The only error my father made was trusting that men like you could be stopped through legal means," Sarah called back. "He documented your crimes, all of them. 17 families murdered or displaced. Gun running to Mexican revolutionaries. Land fraud reaching from here to Washington. Marshal Cooper has that evidence now. You've already lost Colonel." Brennan's expression did not change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Recalculation. He had expected a frightened widow, perhaps some resistance, but not this level of preparation and certainty. "Evidence can be disputed," he said. "Witnesses can be discredited. And federal marshals can have accidents just like Army lieutenants." The threat was delivered with the same calm tone he might use to discuss weather. "But if you surrender peacefully, if you sign over the water rights and leave Arizona, I give you my word as an officer that no further harm will come to you." "Your word means nothing. You had Thomas killed and called it an accident. You poisoned my father over months and claimed it was natural. You've murdered 17 families and blamed it on raiders." Sarah's voice remained steady, conversational, as if discussing simple facts rather than atrocities. "The only word that matters now is justice." Brennan studied the ranch defenses, noting the reinforced positions, the strategic placement of defenders, the professional preparation that spoke of experienced leadership. His eyes found Vernon standing near the barn, recognized him. "Vernon Blackwood," Brennan said. "I should have known. Cochise's old friend. Tell me, Vernon, is this really worth dying for? Some idealistic notion of frontier justice?" Vernon stepped forward, his rifle held casually but ready. "It's worth it to stop men who see this land as nothing but profit, who kill families and call it business. Your backers might have money and influence, Colonel, but out here on this ground, those things don't matter as much as you think." "Noble sentiment, also foolish." Brennan gestured behind him where his 20 men waited in formation. "I have superior numbers, military training, and artillery if I choose to use it. You have a handful of ranch hands and one woman with a rifle, no matter how skilled she might be. This ends with your defeat. The only question is how many die before you accept that reality." Sarah fired. The bullet struck the ground 3 feet in front of Brennan's horse, close enough that the animal shied backward, close enough to demonstrate precision without threatening injury. Brennan controlled his mount with practiced ease, but his expression had hardened. "That was my answer to your offer," Sarah said. "Now here's my counteroffer. You and your men turn around and ride back to Fort Apache. You surrender to Marshal Cooper's authority. You face trial for your crimes. If you do this, no one dies today." Brennan laughed, genuine amusement mixed with contempt. "You actually believe you can win this? Remarkable." He turned his horse, the white flag lowering. "I gave you the chance for mercy, Mrs. Morning. What happens next is on your conscience." He rode back to his men, the pretense of negotiation abandoned. Sarah watched him organize his force, dividing them into 3 groups. 8 men to the east appearing to be the main assault, 6 to the west using the creek bed for cover, and 6 held in reserve to the south, hidden in the brush where Eli's wire waited. "Vernon," Sarah called down, "east and west are feints. The real push comes from the south once we're committed elsewhere." "Understood. I'll hold reserves for the southern line." The eastern group moved first, advancing at a walk, rifles ready but not raised. Professional soldiers, probing defenses, looking for weakness-testing response. Sarah let them come to 300 yards before firing her first shot. The bullet struck the lead rider's canteen, punching through the metal container and spraying water across his saddle. The man jerked in surprise but held his position, understanding immediately that the shot had been a warning, not a miss. If that bullet had been aimed at him instead of his equipment, he would be dead. The eastern group halted, uncertain. They had expected return fire, but not this level of precision at this distance. Sarah's second shot took the hat off another rider, sending it tumbling 20 feet behind him. Still no casualties, but the message was clear. She could hit what she aimed at, and she was choosing not to kill, yet. The western group tried advancing during this distraction, using the creek bed for cover. But Eli had positioned himself perfectly in the barn loft, his rifle covering that approach with overlapping fields of fire. His first shot kicked up dirt between the lead horses, his second splintered wood on a boulder they were using for cover. "Hold," Vernon called to his ranch hands. "Conserve ammunition. Let them commit before we engage fully." The eastern and western groups pulled back slightly, reorganizing. Sarah watched Brennan through her sight, saw him gesture orders to the southern reserve. Here it comes, she thought. The real attack. 6 riders emerged from the southern brush, moving fast, trying to use speed and surprise to overwhelm the defense before it could concentrate. They covered the first 100 yards quickly. Professional cavalry tactics, staggered formation to present multiple targets. Then, the first horse hit Eli's wire. The animal went down hard, throwing its rider tangling 2 other horses in the confusion. The formation broke men struggling to control panicked mounts, the momentum of their charge evaporating into chaos. Sarah shifted her aim to the southern approach, firing rapidly now. 3 shots in 5 seconds, each one striking with brutal precision, not at men, but at equipment. A rifle knocked from hands at 200 yards. A saddle cinch severed, sending a rider tumbling as his saddle slipped. A spur shot clean off a boot, the impact making the man think he had been hit, even though he remained uninjured. Eli's rifle joined hers, working in concert, creating a crossfire that turned the southern approach into a gauntlet of precisely placed bullets. Still, no one was killed, but the psychological impact was devastating. These men had faced enemy fire before, but never anything like this. Never marksmen who could hit specific pieces of equipment at combat ranges while men and horses moved unpredictably. The southern group retreated in disorder, dragging their wounded horses, their confidence shattered. Brennan regrouped his forces, pulling all three elements back beyond effective rifle range. Sarah used the pause to reload, checking her ammunition count. 23 rounds expended, 77 remaining in her immediate supply. Plenty for a sustained defense, but she needed to be strategic about usage. "They're going to come all at once next time," Vernon predicted. "All three directions simultaneously. Try to overwhelm us through volume." "Let them," Sarah said. "We've shown them precision. Now we show them discipline." But Brennan had one more tactical option he had not yet employed. From his reserve position, two men moved forward, carrying something Sarah recognized with cold certainty. A mountain howitzer, a small artillery piece designed for frontier warfare. Light enough to be transported by pack animals, powerful enough to demolish wooden structures at range. "They're going to shell us," Cooper said from his observation post. "Try to force us into the open." Vernon swore quietly. "We didn't prepare for artillery. The barn can't withstand that kind of impact. Neither can most of the buildings." Sarah calculated quickly. The howitzer needed time to set up to aim to load, maybe 3 minutes before the first shot. She had one chance to disable it before it became operational. The range was extreme, 450 yards at least, with morning wind picking up from the east. The target was small mechanical, protected by the men positioning it. But if she could damage the gun carriage or the elevation mechanism, render it inoperable before it could fire. She settled her breathing, feeling her father's training take over. The rifle became an extension of her sight, her will, her purpose. The world narrowed to the target, the wind, the minute adjustments needed for a shot that should have been impossible. She fired. The bullet struck the howitzer's elevating screw, the small brass mechanism that allowed vertical aim adjustment. Metal shattered pieces flying, the gun carriage jerking as the carefully positioned artillery piece suddenly lost calibration. The men around it dove for cover, thinking they were under sustained fire. But Sarah held waiting, watching. The artillery officer emerged cautiously, examining the damage, his face visible even at this distance as he realized what had happened. A single shot, impossibly precise, had disabled a weapon that should have given Brennan overwhelming advantage. She saw Brennan react, saw him stare toward the ranch house, toward her position on the roof. For the first time since arriving, genuine uncertainty crossed his features. This was not going according to any plan he had prepared. The widow he had expected to intimidate was proving to be something entirely different, something dangerous. "All units advance," Brennan's voice carried across the distance, sharp with frustration. "Simultaneous assault. Suppress that roof position." 20 men charged at once, coming from 3 directions, no longer probing, but committed to overwhelming force. Rifles, cracked bullets, striking the ranch buildings, forcing defenders to cover. This was no longer surgical, no longer restrained. This was full assault. Sarah fired methodically, shifting between targets, maintaining the discipline her father had drilled into her. One shot, one hit, one soldier removed from the fight. She aimed for weapons when possible, limbs when necessary, choosing her targets based on tactical priority rather than emotion. Beside her, Vernon's ranch hands returned fire less precisely, but with determination. Eli worked from the barn loft, his rifle accounting for 2 more disabled attackers. Cooper's deputies covered the western approach, their army training evident in their controlled responses, but the sheer volume of incoming fire was beginning to tell. Wood splintered around Sarah's position. A bullet scored the roof inches from her head. She heard a cry from below as one of Vernon's men took a hit, non-fatal, but removing him from the fight. The eastern group reached the barn, taking cover behind its water-soaked walls. The western group was pinned in the creek bed by Cooper's deputies, but laying down, suppressing fire that made movement dangerous. And the southern group was reforming, preparing another push through the wire. "We need to break their momentum," Vernon shouted over the gunfire. "If they coordinate properly, they'll overwhelm us." Sarah scanned the battlefield, looking for the tactical fulcrum, the point where one action could shift the entire engagement. And she found it. Brennan himself positioned on a small rise 400 yards east, directing the assault, the brain coordinating this military operation. She could not kill him. That would make him a martyr, would complicate the legal prosecution Cooper was building. But she could remove him from tactical command, could force him to choose between directing the fight and preserving his own safety. Sarah aimed carefully, compensating for the extreme range, the wind, the moving target as Brennan gestured orders. She exhaled slowly and fired. The bullet struck the reins in Brennan's hands, severing the leather straps with surgical precision. His horse, suddenly freed from control, bolted. Brennan was an excellent rider and maintained his seat, but for crucial seconds he was focused on regaining control rather than commanding his men. Sarah's second shot hit the saber at his hip, the impact knocking it from its scabbard, sending it flying. Her third shot struck his binoculars, shattering the lenses, while he was using them close enough to his face that he felt the impact, understood how close he had come to death. 3 shots in 10 seconds, all hits, all at 400-plus yards, all demonstrating a level of marksmanship that transcended normal military capability. Brennan regained control of his horse and pulled back rapidly, seeking cover. But the damage was done. His men had seen their commander driven from the field, had seen the impossible precision that hunted him specifically. Morale cracked, doubt spreading through the assault force. "Fall back," Brennan's order came. His voice strained. "Regroup at the ridge." The assault broke, soldiers retreating in professional order, but retreating nonetheless. They had tried overwhelming force. They had tried artillery. They had committed everything Brennan had promised would guarantee victory. And they had been stopped by a handful of defenders led by a woman whose shooting defied belief. Sarah lowered her rifle, breathing hard, adrenaline still singing in her veins. Below, Vernon was checking casualties. 2 men wounded, neither critically. Minor damage to buildings. Ammunition expended, but still adequate for continued defense. They had survived the first major assault, but Brennan still had men, still had resources, and now he had something more dangerous than confidence. He had desperation. "They'll try again," Eli said, climbing to the roof. "But not immediately. Brennan needs to restore morale, come up with new tactics. We have maybe an hour." "Cooper?" Sarah called down. "Any word from Fort Bowie?" The marshal emerged from his position, dust covering his uniform. "Sent the telegram before the assault started. Colonel Morrison is mobilizing a relief column, but they're 30 miles out. 6 hours minimum before they arrive." "What about Harrington?" Sarah asked. Cooper nodded. "Secured at Fort Bowie under Morrison's guard. He's providing testimony about Brennan's operation. His cooperation will strengthen the case. 6 hours." Sarah looked at their ammunition supplies, at the exhausted defenders, at the damage already sustained. Could they hold for 6 more hours against a determined enemy? Then she heard it. A sound that changed everything. Horses approaching from the north, moving fast, dozens of them. For a moment Sarah's heart sank, thinking Brennan had reinforcements, but the riders who appeared wore different uniforms. U.S. cavalry from Fort Bowie, led by a colonel whose bearing screamed authority and integrity in equal measure. Colonel David Morrison had gray hair, a scarred face from decades of frontier service, and eyes that missed nothing. He surveyed the battlefield, the damaged artillery, the scattered positions of Brennan's men, then looked up at Sarah on the roof. "Mrs. Morning," he called. "Marshal Cooper sent word of an illegal military action by Colonel Brennan. Appears he was correct." Brennan rode forward, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "Colonel Morrison, this is a military operation pursuing escaped federal prisoners. These civilians interfered with authorized actions." Morrison's expression did not change. "That's fascinating, Colonel Brennan. Perhaps you can explain it at your court-martial. U.S. cavalry surround and disarm those men. Anyone who resists will be treated as mutineers." The Fort Bowie soldiers moved with efficient precision, outnumbering Brennan's force 2-1, their authority unquestionable. Brennan's men, already demoralized, surrendered without resistance. They were professional soldiers following orders, not fanatics willing to die for a corrupt officer's schemes. Brennan himself sat rigid in his saddle, watching his carefully constructed operation collapse around him. When Morrison's men reached for his weapon, he handed it over with mechanical precision, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Colonel Richard Brennan," Morrison said formally, "you are hereby relieved of command and placed under arrest pending investigation of charges including murder, conspiracy, gun running, and treason. You will be transported to Fort Bowie for detention until federal authorities can arrange formal prosecution." Sarah climbed down from the roof, her rifle still in hand, but no longer needed. She walked across the battlefield she had defended, past the scattered evidence of engagement to where Brennan sat under guard. Their eyes met. His held cold calculation, even in defeat, already planning appeals, legal maneuvers, the corruption he would leverage to escape consequences. But something else flickered there too, a grudging respect for an opponent who had exceeded every expectation. "Your father was a worthy adversary," Brennan said quietly, "and it seems he trained his daughter well. That shooting today, the artillery piece, the personal equipment, I've seen Army snipers who could not match that precision." "My father taught me that justice requires patience," Sarah replied, "that the most important victories are won not through violence, but through evidence and law. You killed him before he could see his work completed, but I will finish it. We'll see. I have resources you cannot imagine. Lawyers, political connections, judges who owe favors. This is far from over." "You're right," Sarah said. "It's not over, but it's already lost. For you." Marshal Cooper approached, carrying the evidence package Sarah had entrusted to him. "Colonel Morrison, I have documentation compiled by Cochise Morning and Lieutenant Thomas Morning. 17 cases of murder and land fraud, all connected to Colonel Brennan and a network of corrupt officials. This evidence will be presented to federal court in Tucson." Morrison nodded grimly. "I'll ensure it reaches the right authorities, and I'll personally testify to what I witnessed here today, an illegal military operation conducted against civilian homesteaders using Army resources for private gain." As Brennan was led away, his men secured and disarmed, Sarah felt something release in her chest. The immediate threat was over. The ranch was secure. The evidence would reach trial. Her father's work would see completion. Vernon joined her, his face showing exhaustion, but also satisfaction. "Cochise would be proud. You held the ranch, you protected the evidence, and you did it the right way." "We did it," Sarah corrected. "I could not have held alone. Your strategy, Eli's tactics, Cooper's legal authority, Morrison's intervention, this was never about one person's heroism." "No," Vernon agreed. "It was about people willing to stand together against corruption. That's the real victory here." But even as celebrations began, even as defenders checked wounds and damage and shared the relief of survival, Sarah saw something that made her blood run cold. A rider approaching from the east, well-dressed despite the desert heat. Sarah recognized the type immediately: Eastern lawyer, expensive suit, the kind of legal talent that corruption bought. Vernon confirmed it with a quiet curse. "That'll be Brennan's defense counsel. Probably cost more than my ranch is worth." "I am Jonathan Hartwick," he announced, "legal counsel for Colonel Brennan. I carry writs from territorial judges, affidavits from witnesses, and documentation that will prove my client's innocence of all charges. The trial will be held in Tucson as requested, but I assure you, Colonel Brennan will walk free." Sarah felt the victory suddenly tainted. They had won the battle. They had secured the evidence. But the war was far from over. Brennan's resources, his connections, his willingness to corrupt any system for personal gain, all of that remained intact. The lawyer smiled confident in the power he represented. "See you in court, Mrs. Morning. May the best legal team win." The federal courthouse in Tucson was built from adobe and timber, a structure that had witnessed the transformation of Arizona from untamed territory to something approaching civilization. Sarah sat in the front row of the gallery, Vernon beside her, as the trial of Colonel Richard Brennan entered its third day. The room was packed with spectators, journalists from Eastern papers, territorial officials who understood that this case would define how justice functioned on the frontier. Judge Henry Whitmore presided, a circuit judge brought from Denver specifically because he had no connections to Arizona's territorial politics. He was 68, with silver hair and eyes that had seen every legal maneuver attempted in 4 decades of frontier jurisprudence. He was not a man easily fooled or intimidated. Jonathan Hartwick, Brennan's lawyer, was presenting his defense with theatrical precision. He was 45, educated at Harvard Law, expensive enough that his presence alone testified to the resources backing Brennan's defense. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Hartwick said, pacing before them with practiced confidence, "the prosecution would have you believe that Colonel Brennan, a decorated officer with 28 years of distinguished service, suddenly became a criminal mastermind orchestrating murder and land fraud across 3 territories. This strains credulity." He gestured toward the evidence table where Cochise's ledgers and Thomas's journal sat under guard. These documents were compiled by men who tragically are no longer alive to verify their accuracy or explain their methods. We have only the word of Mrs. Morning, a grieving widow whose judgment may be clouded by loss, that these papers represent factual accounts rather than misunderstandings or personal grudges. Sarah felt Vernon's hand on her arm, steadying. They had anticipated this line of attack. Hartwick's strategy was to discredit the evidence by discrediting its source, to paint Cochise and Thomas as unreliable observers whose conclusions could not be trusted. Marshal Cooper took the stand. His uniform pressed his bearing, that of a career lawman who had testified in dozens of trials. The prosecutor, a federal attorney named Elizabeth Chen, led him through methodical questioning. "Marshal Cooper, please describe for the jury what you witnessed at Morning Star Ranch on September 22nd. Cooper's testimony was precise, documented with written notes taken during the engagement. He described Brennan's illegal use of military forces against civilian homesteaders, the attempted artillery bombardment, the professional assault that could only have been ordered by someone with military authority. Hartwick cross-examined aggressively. "Marshal Cooper, did you actually hear Colonel Brennan give orders to attack Mrs. Morning's ranch?" "No, but the soldiers were under his command." "So you're inferring his responsibility based on chain of command, not direct evidence of criminal intent." "The attack was coordinated, professional, and conducted by soldiers from Fort Apache. Colonel Brennan was their commanding officer. That establishes command structure, not criminal conspiracy. Perhaps these soldiers acted without authorization, pursuing what they believed to be escaped prisoners." The legal maneuvering continued for hours, Hartwick chipping away at each piece of testimony, creating doubt where he could, minimizing where he could not. He was skilled, expensive, and absolutely committed to securing Brennan's acquittal. Then Vernon took the stand. The old rancher moved slowly to the witness chair, his joints protesting, but his mind was sharp as he was sworn in. Elizabeth Chen approached with respect evident in her posture. "Mr. Blackwood, how long did you know Cochise Morning?" 32 years, since before Arizona was a proper territory. "And in those 32 years, did you ever know him to lie or fabricate evidence?" "Never. Cochise was the most honest man I knew. He documented things because he believed in facts and truth that could be verified rather than rumors that changed with telling," Hartwick objected. "Character testimony is not evidence of document accuracy," Judge Whitmore overruled. The witness may speak to the deceased's reputation for honesty. Continue, Mr. Chen. Vernon described Cochise's final months, the systematic poisoning, the desperate effort to complete his documentation before death. He produced the sealed letter Cochise had entrusted to him, its authenticity verified by handwriting experts. This letter, Vernon said, his voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom, was given to me 4 years ago with specific instructions. Cochise knew he was dying. He knew who had poisoned him, and he made sure the truth would survive even after he could not. Hartwick's cross-examination was sharp. Mr. Blackwood, you're Mrs. Morning's neighbor and friend. You have financial interest in preventing railroad development that might compete with your own ranching operations. Isn't it possible your testimony is colored by personal bias? Vernon met the lawyer's eyes steadily. I have bias toward truth, toward seeing murderers face justice. If that makes my testimony unreliable, then I suppose you'll have to convince the jury that truth doesn't matter as much as legal technicalities. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Whitmore gabbled for silence. Eli Stone testified next, describing his tracking work, the evidence he had found at the Cortez mine, the interrogation of Sheriff Reed he had witnessed. His testimony was factual, methodical, each statement backed by physical evidence he had documented. Then came Miguel Santos. The young man had spent 6 months in federal detention, awaiting trial, his cooperation with authorities earning him consideration for reduced sentence. He took the stand nervously, very aware that his testimony would determine not just Brennan's fate, but his own. Mr. Santos, Elizabeth Chen said gently, please tell the jury how you came to join the Raven's Claw gang. Miguel's story emerged in halting sentences. Orphaned at 16, desperate for work, recruited by Blackwood with promises of legitimate ranch security, discovering too late that the work involved intimidation, violence, murder. When did you first hear the name Ghost Rider? Chen asked. 3 months after I joined. Blackwood mentioned him when we were planning a job. Said the Ghost Rider had authorized it, said we'd be protected if anything went wrong. Did you later learn who the Ghost Rider was? Yes, it was Colonel Brennan. I saw him meet with Blackwood twice. The second time he gave specific orders about Morning Star Ranch, said it needed to be cleared for railroad development. Said violence was authorized if necessary. Hartwick's cross-examination was brutal. He painted Miguel as a criminal seeking leniency through false testimony. But Miguel held firm, his answers consistent with the documentary evidence, his remorse genuine enough that even hostile questioning could not shake it. I did terrible things, Miguel said at one point. I followed orders I should have refused. But I'm telling the truth now because it's the only way to make any of it right. Sheriff Reed testified despite his injuries, describing the ambush, his interrogation by Harrington, the questions about Cochise's evidence that proved foreknowledge of the conspiracy, his credibility as a law enforcement officer with 20 years' experience carried significant weight. And finally Sarah took the stand. She had dressed simply for court, avoiding anything that might seem calculated to gain sympathy. She wore a plain dark dress, her hair pinned back, no jewelry except Thomas's wedding ring. When she was sworn in, her voice was steady, clear, carrying the same certainty she brought to rifle shooting. Elizabeth Chen led her through her testimony methodically. Sarah described her father's final months, his systematic documentation of corruption, his poisoning. She described Thomas's investigation, his journal entries, his murder disguised as accident. She described the attack on her ranch, the impossible situation of defending against military forces with illegal orders. Then Chen asked the critical question. Mrs. Morning, you're an accomplished marksman. Could you describe your training for the jury? Sarah explained her father's teaching, the combination of Apache techniques and Army precision, the years of practice that developed skills beyond normal expectations. She was factual, avoiding boasting, but honest about her capabilities. And during the defense of your ranch, you had opportunities to kill Colonel Brennan or his men. Why didn't you? Because my father taught me that justice requires law, not revenge. That the most important victories are won in courtrooms, not battlefields. I defended my property and protected evidence, but I never forgot that the goal was to bring criminals to trial, not to become one myself. Hartwick's cross-examination was the most aggressive of the trial. He questioned her credibility, her motives, her interpretation of events. He suggested that grief had made her see conspiracy where there was only coincidence, that she had manufactured evidence to justify her vendetta. "Mrs. Morning," he said, with theatrical sympathy, "you've suffered terrible losses. Your mother, your father, your husband. Isn't it possible that your grief has caused you to construct an elaborate narrative where powerful men are responsible, rather than accepting that life on the frontier involves risk and tragedy?" Sarah met his eyes calmly. "My grief is real, but so is the evidence. You can question my emotions, Mr. Hartwick. You cannot question bank records, shipping manifests, witness testimony, and documentary proof compiled over 4 years by 2 different investigators. But those investigators are conveniently dead, unable to explain inconsistencies or defend their methods. They're dead because Colonel Brennan had them killed. That's what this trial is about." The courtroom erupted. Judge Whitmore gabbled for order. Hartwick moved for mistrial based on prejudicial statements. The motion was denied. The trial continued for 2 more days. Expert witnesses testified about arsenic poisoning, confirming that Cochise's symptoms matched slow administration of the toxin. Handwriting analysts verified the authenticity of documents. Banking officials confirmed suspicious transfers that matched the ledger entries exactly. And through it all, Brennan sat silent, his expression controlled, revealing nothing. He was playing a longer game, confident that his connections, his resources, his careful cultivation of influential people would ultimately protect him. But on the 7th day, the jury returned after 4 hours of deliberation. The foreman was a rancher from southern Arizona, a man who had spent 40 years building something from nothing, who understood the difference between honest profit and criminal theft. He stood when the judge asked for the verdict, his weathered face showing the weight of the decision. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant guilty." Brennan's expression finally cracked shock and fury, breaking through his controlled facade. "On the charge of ordering the deaths of Cochise Morning and Thomas Morning, we find the defendant guilty." Hartwick was on his feet, objecting, demanding poll of the jury, his confidence shattered. "On the charges of gun running, land fraud, illegal use of military forces, and 17 counts of accessory to murder, we find the defendant guilty on all counts." The courtroom exploded into chaos. Journalists rushed for doors to file stories. Spectators argued loudly. Brennan sat rigid, staring straight ahead, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him. Judge Whitmore gabbled for silence. When order was finally restored, he addressed Brennan directly. "Colonel Richard Brennan, you have been found guilty of crimes that betray every principle of military honor and frontier justice. You used your position to orchestrate murder for profit. You corrupted institutions meant to protect citizens. You saw this territory not as home but as resource to be exploited." The judge paused, letting the words settle. "The prosecution has requested the death penalty. I am inclined to grant it. However, I will take time to consider appropriate sentencing. We will reconvene tomorrow at 9 o'clock. That night, Sarah sat with Vernon on the courthouse steps, watching the sunset paint Tucson in shades of gold and crimson. They did not speak for a long time, both processing what the verdict meant. "You're doing exactly what Cochise trained you for," Vernon said finally. "You finished what he started." "We finished it," Sarah corrected. "Your testimony, Eli's evidence, Miguel's courage, Cooper's coordination. This was never about one person." Vernon smiled. "Your father used to say that legacy isn't built alone. It's built with others, for others, by people willing to sacrifice immediate comfort for long-term justice." The next morning, Judge Whitmore delivered his sentence. Life imprisonment in federal prison, no possibility of parole. Harrington received 20 years, Blackwood 10 with credit for his cooperation, Miguel 2 years plus probation for turning state's evidence. The European banking interests and corrupt officials named in Cochise's evidence would face separate trials. The network was being dismantled piece by piece, the conspiracy exposed to light where it could not survive. 2 weeks after the trial ended, Sarah returned to Morningstar Ranch. The property showed damage from the siege, but nothing structural, nothing that could not be repaired. Vernon had already begun organizing reconstruction, his ranch hands working alongside Sarah's to restore what violence had broken. The railroad company sent representatives within days of Brennan's sentencing. They offered to purchase water rights at fair market value, their tone respectful now that the illegal option had been eliminated. Sarah refused politely but firmly. "This land is not for sale," she told them. "It was chosen carefully, defended at cost, and it will remain in my family as long as I live." The representatives accepted this with surprising grace. Without Brennan's corruption to enable theft, they had no choice but to respect legal property rights and find alternative routes for their expansion. Sarah restructured the ranch operations with Vernon's advice. He would serve as general manager, bringing his decades of experience to day-to-day operations. Eli Stone accepted a permanent position as head of ranch security and tracking operations, his skills too valuable to waste. And Miguel, upon completion of his sentence, would be offered work as foreman if he proved his commitment to honest labor. 3 months after the trial, on a cool November morning, Sarah rode to the family cemetery on the eastern edge of ranch property. 3 graves rested there, marked by simple stones: Desba mourning her mother, Cochise mourning her father, Thomas mourning her husband. She dismounted and stood before them, feeling the weight of everything that had happened since she last visited. The siege, the trial, the victory that felt both complete and incomplete. "I finished it," she said quietly, speaking to the dead as naturally as she once spoke to the living. "The evidence you compiled, Father, it brought them down. Thomas, your journal helped convict the man who ordered your death. Mother, your teachings about patience and precision made it all possible." The wind moved through the desert grass, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Sarah touched each headstone in turn, feeling connection to the people who had made her who she was. "I'm not alone," she continued. "Vernon watches over me like you asked, Father. Eli has become a friend who understands both worlds I navigate. The ranch is secure, the land protected. Your legacy lives." She stayed there for an hour, watching the sun climb higher, warming the stones, the earth, the living land that had cost so much to defend. Then she mounted and rode back to the ranch house, ready to continue the work of building rather than fighting. 1 year after Brennan's conviction, Morningstar Ranch had transformed into something larger than simple cattle operation. Sarah had established a school on the property teaching young women skills her father had taught her. Reading, mathematics, practical sciences, but also tracking, shooting, self-defense, skills that allowed frontier women to protect themselves and contribute to community security. Vernon managed the cattle operation with quiet efficiency, his experience turning the ranch profitable, while maintaining the sustainable practices Cochise had insisted upon. Eli ran a tracking and guide service teaching Apache techniques to Army scouts and civilian explorers. Miguel, released after serving his sentence with exemplary behavior, had proven himself invaluable as foreman, his energy and reformed character inspiring trust. The ranch employed 15 people permanently, with seasonal workers adding another dozen during busy periods. It had become a model of how frontier enterprise could succeed through honest labor rather than corruption and theft. Sarah herself never remarried, though she received proposals regularly. She was content with the life she had built, with the community she had helped create, with the legacy she was actively preserving rather than simply inheriting. On the anniversary of the siege, she stood on the ranch house roof where she had made her stand, looking out over land that now held different meaning. Not just property, but proof that justice could prevail when people refused to accept corruption as inevitable. Vernon joined her, moving more slowly than a year ago, but still sharp, still engaged. Cochise used to say that some victories take generations to understand, that the most important thing we do is create foundation for those who come after. He was right, Sarah said. This ranch isn't just land anymore. It's example. Proof that standing against power is possible, that law can triumph over corruption when people are willing to fight for it properly. Below them, students from the school practiced shooting under Eli's supervision. Miguel coordinated ranch hands preparing for spring roundup. Cooper, who visited regularly, sat on the porch comparing notes with Vernon about territorial development and the slow progress of rooting out remaining corruption. Cochise knew you'd become this, Vernon said, watching the students below. Not just a defender, but a builder. That's the legacy he wanted. Sarah looked at the canyon wall that had protected their backs during the siege, at the land her parents had chosen with such care, at the community that had formed around shared values rather than shared fear. Legacy, she said quietly, not just what we leave behind, but what we build into the people who survive us. Father understood that. Now I do too. The sun set over White River Valley, painting the landscape in familiar shades of amber and gold. Morning Star Ranch stood secure, its water flowing freely, its land protected by law and community rather than violence and secrecy. And Sarah Cochise, mourning widow and sharpshooter, stood watch over it all, not as solitary defender, but as teacher-leader. Example of what was possible when courage met discipline, when precision served justice, when legacy was understood as responsibility rather than inheritance. The frontier was changing, becoming something more civilized, more lawful, more just. And Sarah had helped shape that change not through revolution or rhetoric, but through simple unwillingness to accept corruption as inevitable. Her father had taught her to shoot, but he had also taught her something more important, that the most powerful weapon is not the rifle, but the refusal to be broken, the determination to finish what others start, the patience to wait for justice rather than settle for revenge. As darkness fell and stars emerged over Arizona territory, Sarah climbed down from the roof and joined her community for evening meal. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students, new opportunities to build on the foundation her parents had created. But tonight she allowed herself to rest, to remember, to honor those who had died protecting truth, and to understand finally that their deaths had not been in vain. Morning Star Ranch endured, the legacy lived on, and justice hard won and dearly bought had finally prevailed. The end.